This is part one of tissues. We have covered the first portion in lecture. I apologize about the delay in getting this video uploaded for you guys. But again, this will be a good resource to look back and see what's kind of important and to review coming up to the exam. You guys have objectives that are listed in the handout that I've given you. We'll kind of briefly cover these throughout this video, but let's dive in. So we need to first understand what a tissue is. And a tissue is going to be a group of cells that have a common embryonic origin. This means they originated from the same place, whether this be an ectoderm, an endoderm, or a mesoderm, as we previously discussed in lecture. But they function together to carry out specialized activities. It's important to know the three forms of tissues and to just be kind of familiar with those. We have hard, semi-solid, and liquid. Again, we said that liquid was kind of the oddball as it's blood. You don't really think about blood being a tissue, but tissues are, the blood cells are in contact with each other and serve a function of carrying nutrients, gases, and different electrolytes to other specific areas of the body. Hard, this one makes sense. You think about the bone, you think about osteocytes, meaning the bone cells, they're in contact with each other to form bone. And you have something called adipocytes, which are fat cells. Fat cells are, whenever they come together, they form something called subcutaneous tissue. We talked about histology and pathology. We talked about if you took a biopsy of a mass and you looked at these cells underneath the microscope, you would actually look at the histology or the structure of the tissue themselves. And the person that would look at the tissues underneath the microscope, that would be the pathologist. So they would be able to diagnose disease based off of the tissue structures themselves. So the study of tissue in order to diagnose disease, this is known as pathology. The actual study of the tissue themselves, this is histology. So it's this disease process that really separates histology from pathology. Then we talked about the four types of tissue, knowing that there's epithelial, connective, muscular, and nervous. So epithelial, it's important to know that these cover body surface areas. So I want you to think of the skin. The skin is a good example of epithelial tissue. They also line hollow organs and body cavities. So you think about the thoracic cavity, there's going to be epithelial tissue that's going to be responsible for covering this thoracic body cavity. Connective tissue connects things. When you think about connective tissue, a lot of times I think about cartilage and things like that. These are responsible for protection, providing support, and binding organs. Muscular, think about muscular providing movement. These generate physical force needed to make body structures move. Then you think about nervous. Nervous is going to do exactly what it says. It's going to detect changes in the body and respond by generating nerve impulses. So again, going through these, epithelial covers body surfaces. Connective is going to provide support. Muscular is going to be responsible for movement. And then nervous is going to be responsible for generating nerve impulses. Now, it's important to understand how do these types of tissues, how do they develop? And if you remember back to our discussion on mitosis and meiosis, you'll understand that meiosis is the generation of germ cells. These germ cells are going to come from, they're going to form an embryo, and from there we're going to have the development of a fetus eventually. And you need to understand that these germ cells are going to provide the development of the organism themselves. So within these germ cells, you have three different layers. You have an ectoderm, an endoderm, and a mesoderm. Now, the ectoderm, this is the outside cellular layer. The endoderm is going to be the inside cellular layer, and the mesoderm is going to be the middle cellular layer. And these different germ layers are going to form different things within the organism themselves. So it's important to know that all epithelial tissues develop from all three germ layers. So Epithelial tissues develop from all three germ layers. The connective tissue and most muscular tissue derives from the mesoderm. And I said the mesoderm is the means of traveling. Okay? The mesoderm is the means of traveling, and you know that you need your muscular system and your connective tissue system in order to travel. Right? Muscular is responsible for movement. Connective tissue is responsible for providing protection and support. The nervous system develops from the ectoderm. Okay. Here's just the process of once the germ cells come together, they'll form a zygote. The zygote will undergo cleavage to form this 8-cellular layer. Again, this is just cellular division that's occurring, mitosis, and eventually forms something called a blastula. And a blastula is just a hollow ball. As you continue to undergo more cleavage and development, there's a process called gastrulation in which there's an invagination forms here. And within this gastrulation, you can see the different layers forming. You've got the ectoderm, which is on the outside, and the endoderm, which is on the inside. And eventually you have the formation of this mesodermal layer. This is just another picture here showing you in a cross section the different layers. You've got the ectoderm on this outside here. Got this endoderm on the inside here, and as this gastrulation is occurring, you're having the formation of this mesoderm here. It's important to know that epithelial tissue is just a group of a group of cells that form these continuous sheets. All right, so you've got a sheet of cells that can either be arranged in single layers or multiple layers. If you guys remember when we said they're in single layers, they're called simple. And when they're in multiple layers, we call that stratified. It's important to know the major functions. They provide a selective barrier, so when cells come together, they protect us and regulate the movement of materials inside and outside of the body. So we talked about how fentanyl is able to get inside and permeate these cells. This is why it's important to wear gloves when you're handling any type of narcotics. Talked about how sweat is secreted to the outside of the body, so we have a secretory surface. And we also know that the epithelial tissue provides a protective surface, right? And we talked about how when the skin is cut, it allows microorganisms that are present on the skin to invade inside of the body. This is just a histological slide showing you the epidermal layer. And we talked about the features of the epithelial surfaces. We know there's 3 distinct surfaces, and I drew the triangle on the board. And we talked about the apex being the roof, the apical surface. This is going to be the surface that faces the body surface, the body cavity, lumen, or duct. We know we have the roof, which is the apical surface. We know we have a basal surface, which is on the basement. This is opposite of the apical layer and adheres to the basal lamina. We know that the basement membrane on the basal surface is made up of 2 layers, right? Remember, the basement membrane is responsible for attachment to surfaces and anchoring and supporting to the underlying connective tissue. We said it's made of the basal lamina, which is closest to the epithelial tissue, and we said that there's a reticular lamina, which is closest to the underlying connective tissue. Both of those make up the basal surface. And then we know that there's a lateral surface, which faces the adjacent cells. Show you guys this on this picture. Here's the apical surface up here. Again, this is what I would consider the roof. And underlying here is a basal surface. Again, this is similar to the basement of the house, right? It's closest to the basement membrane. Then the basement membrane, you have the basal lamina, which is closer to the epithelium. Then you have the reticular lamina, which is closest to the underlying connective tissue. And then adjacent to each cell is the lateral surface. So here we'll talk about the basement membrane. We said that this is a thin double extracellular layer that serves as the point of attachment. So this is the attachment surface for the epithelium. The epithelium is going to come down here and attach to the basement membrane. We said that the basement membrane is composed of 2 distinct layers, the basal lamina and the reticular lamina. The basal lamina, again, this is going to be the layer that's closest to the epithelial cells. And we have the underlying reticular lamina. This is closer to the underlying connective tissue. As you can see here in this picture, you've got the basal lamina. Both of these are present, making up the basement membrane. The basal lamina, which is closest to the epithelium, and you have the underlying reticular lamina, which is closest to the connective tissue. Within this connective tissue, I just want to point out that we have nerve supply coming up here to the epithelium. It's penetrating the basement membrane and coming to the epithelium. And we have this blood vessel as it's permeating here and coming in and bringing blood supply to the epithelium that's above. Why is this important? It's important because the epithelium does not have its own nerve and vascular supply. We said that it's a term called avascular, meaning without vascular supply. And we'll cover this on this next slide. So epithelial cells do not contain their own nerve supply. Again, this is within the connective tissue. And epithelial cells are avascular, meaning they lack a blood supply. Blood vessels in the connective tissue bring nutrients and eliminate waste. We know this. Epithelial cells have a high rate of cell division. What's the other term for cell division? Mitosis, absolutely, for renewal and repair. And we said this is why whenever we cut our finger, we eventually form a scar. It's because of this high rate of mitotic activity in which we don't have a hole or a laceration in our hand for a year, right? It repairs itself within usually a couple weeks, and it's because of this high rate of cell division. Again, this is just the picture here showing you the different surfaces. The apical surface being at the top, it's at the apex, the roof of the house. The basal surface being the basement, it's at the bottom, closest to the basement membrane. Within this basement membrane, we know that we have a basal lamina, which is closest to the epithelium, and we have an underlying reticular lamina, which is closest to the underlying connective tissue. We said that the connective tissue has the nerve and the blood vessel supply. The nerve supply is coming in here to supply the epithelium, and the vascular supply is also present within the underlying connective tissue. Here's the lateral surfaces. I equated this to being the rooms in the house, right? This is just another picture. This is probably on electron microscopy, an EM scope, showing you the epithelium in its relationship to the underlying basement membrane. Here you would have the apical surface. Here you would have the lateral surface. And again, as we're approaching the basement membrane, you would see that there's a basal layer and a reticular layer. So whenever I think about epithelial tissue, you can really break it down into two categories. You've either got glandular epithelium, which is responsible for secretion, so whether it be thyroid, secreting thyroid hormone, adrenal gland secreting adrenal hormones such as cortisol and sex hormones or aldosterone, and there's also sweat glands. Or you can think about it being a epithelium that covers or lines things. So I think about the skin. It's a covering of our body, of our muscular system. So when you want to name covering and lining epithelium, you can break this down into the nomenclature that we either talk about the shape, whether it's cuboidal, squamous, or columnar, right? Whether it's square, column-shaped, or cube-shaped. Or we talk about the arrangement of the cells in the layers. Is it simple or is it stratified? Does it have a single layer or does it have two layers? So let's go into the arrangement of the cells. So if it's simple epithelium, this is a single layer of cells. Or if it's stratified, these are two or more layers of cells. So I would like for you to know how we name them and what their functions are. So if it's simple epithelium, they function in diffusion and osmosis, filtration, secretion, or absorption. If it's stratified, it's going to protect, right? It's going to be responsible for protection of underlying tissues. So pseudo, meaning fake, stratified, pseudo-stratified, it appears as if it's two layers, right? But it's actually not, it's a fake. It appears to have multiple layers because cell nuclei are at different levels. All the cells do not reach the apical surface, so all the cells do not reach the top of the cell. Here's a picture here just kind of depicting what simple looks like. As you can see here, we have this centrally located nucleus, and it's in a single layer. Stratified, we can see that we have this single central nucleus present, and there's multiple layers of it. Pseudostratified, this appears as if it has multiple layers. Again, the nuclei is going to be present in different layers here, and it appears as if it's multiple layers, but it's actually not. It never reaches the apex. Now let's talk about the shape. You have squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and transitional. Squamous, these are going to be thin cells arranged like floor tiles. They're kind of square shaped. These allow for the passage of substances. Cuboidal are going to be wide, shaped like cubes or hexagons. Remember, they have the cilia or flagella present that are kind of like microvilli, and that's going to be responsible for absorption. Columnar, they're going to be much taller than they are wide, kind of like a column. Again, these also have cilium and microvilli present as well, responsible for absorption or secretion. Transitional means that exactly like the word implies, they're in transition. The cells change shapes. This is going to be responsible for stretching, right? And I said that there's only really one area in the body that there's transitional epithelium, and that's present within the urinary bladder. It's important for the bladder to be able to stretch and collapse to a smaller size. Here's a picture of the cell shape. This is squamous, kind of arranged like floor tiles. You can see here this is cuboidal, shaped in this hexagonal shape, and columnar are going to be much taller than they are wide. This is a picture of the transitional epithelium, cells in all different shapes and sizes, present within the bladder. So covering the lining epithelium can be broken down further based on shape, arrangement, and function into the following categories: simple epithelium, pseudostratified columnar epithelium, or stratified epithelium. It's important for the exam to know how they are different, where they are found, and what is their function. So whenever I think about simple epithelium, we can think about simple squamous, meaning a single layer of flat-shaped cells, right? Square-tiled shells or cells. Simple cuboidal, a single layer of cube-shaped cells. Simple columnar, a single layer of column-shaped cells. There's non-ciliated, meaning they don't have cilia, as well as ciliated. Pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium. So simple squamous. The nucleus is centrally located and appears flattened. And we know that they're squamous, so this is the flattened or oval-shaped appearance. And they're simple, so I mean there's a single layer. It's important to know that these are going to be responsible for filtration or diffusion. Here's a picture here showing you these simple squamous. See, there's a single layer here. Here's the flat nucleus that's present of these simple squamous cells. This would be a cross-section of the small intestine, so it makes sense that they would be here for diffusion of substances across of that cellular membrane. Again, this is just another picture here kind of depicting to you what simple squamous epithelium looks like. You can see here this single layer with the centrally located nucleus, the squamous shape of the tile-shaped. Thinnest tissue of the body allows transport across the membranes in the lungs and the capillaries. So again, responsible for diffusion, as oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to need to diffuse across the lungs. And this is where we stopped at in the lecture. So this is where we will conclude the first portion of the lecture preview. We will pick up with the second portion just briefly. Thank you, guys.